Thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. I know Nasser and I are particularly excited for this session because we have been eagerly anticipating, waiting for the first movement of any EU member state on the Pay Transparency Directive. Here at Trusaic, we have spent a lot of time and energy in developing our regulatory compliance products related to pay equity and pay data compliance globally. And as such, we have been kind of monitoring and paying a lot of attention to this directive and seeing how it's going to filter through. Our session today is kind of broken up into two different parts. One, I'm going to spend some time talking about the EU directive itself, some of the pieces of it, some of the timelines that some of you might already be familiar with. And then Nasser is going to go into a deep dive for us on Sweden's proposed implementation of that directive. And then we're going to have some time to just kind of talk about what this means, how we think that this is going to play out as far as final format, what other EU member states might do. Yeah, it should be fun. So thank you again for joining us. To begin off, the EU directive. So in March of 2023, the European Union approved the Pay Transparency Directive for its EU member states. The aim of the directive was to strengthen the application of the principles of equal pay for equal work or work of equal value between men and women through pay transparency and enforcement mechanisms, right? EU member states were given roughly 3 years from the passing of the directive to implement it, right? So Sweden is the first of these EU member states that has proposed some form of implementation. Our caveat here is obviously this is a proposal from Sweden. It's not their final implementation, but it does give us an opportunity to kind of talk about what EU member states might do, how they're approaching this directive, especially those that have existing pay transparency, pay data compliance measures in place. So EU directive, just to give you a broad overview, right? So 3-year period, as I said, for implementation, right? And, we put EU member states roughly into 2 different buckets here, right? When we're thinking about them. And we're guessing at this point in time that implementation of the directive is going to be different, generally speaking, for the countries in these 2 different buckets. Right. So first, we've got the 14 EU member states that have existing reporting requirements. Right. Those include Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Portugal, Spain, and Sweden. Now, the requirements for each of those different EU member states, which we're not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail today outside of some of Sweden's requirements, vary wildly. Right. Spain's is very different from France's, is very different from Austria's. There's a lot of variation here. Then we've got the 13 EU member states that don't have an existing requirement, right? Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Greece, Malta, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And, one of the things that Nasser and I have been talking about a lot over the past, 6 months to a year as we've been anticipating this is what kind of differences are we going to see in the implementation of this directive between these 2 different buckets, right? Because you have some EU member states that are starting with a blank slate. You have others with existing requirements. And the directive doesn't require them to get rid of any of their existing requirements, right? The directive is like a minimum baseline, right? They have the discretion to implement more stringent measures. And so really the question for us has been, are EU member states going to take advantage of that flexibility, right? Are we going to see them changing their existing reporting requirements, layering the directive on top of them, going in a completely different direction? So we're excited to kind of see what the first EU member state is proposing doing in that regard.
Yeah, and on that point, Maxfield, it's going to be really interesting to see how this varies among different EU member states. Even now, when we're talking about a reporting requirement, a report is even that phrase. Some of these don't even sort of report out on a regular basis. So for for a country like Spain, for example, they do have sort of robust pay reporting requirements in place, or they have to do a job evaluation system, they have to do a pay audit, they have to really analyze the pay differences, and eventually that culminates to submitting that to the relevant Spanish government authority. Where some of these jurisdictions also, they don't really have an outward reporting requirement. They might have it where you store some of that information internally and you just keep it there, and you wait to potentially, if there might be an audit on your company, you're going to have to produce those documents. But that level of robustness in the laws just really vary. And even Sweden is an example where the previous law prior to what they're proposing is one of those countries where you just sort of store that information in a box and wait for potential someone to inspect it. So yeah, it really varies on the EU member states.
Yeah, and one of the things that I was always curious, or have been curious about there, Nasser, is for those jurisdictions that have a compliance duty of some sort, right, but don't necessarily have a reporting requirement attached to that compliance duty, are they going to add that to some of their existing measures that they might leave in place, right? So it is fascinating to me. We'll see more of this, obviously, as more EU member states start proposing their own implementation. We'll see, is it just going to be a layering on top, or is it going to be a complete removal? Or is it going to be a tinkering with the existing requirements in some way, making them kind of line up a little bit more with the added requirements of the EU Pay Transparency Directive? So I think it's really going to be fascinating as we move forward. To give everybody just kind of a basic overview of the EU directive, right? So the EU Pay Transparency Directive introduces mandatory pay data reporting, right, as well as some assessment requirements for employers that discover their significant pay gaps, right? So pay data reporting is going to apply for employers with at least 100 workers, and they'll be required to disclose pay gap information, right? They're going to need to collect all worker level data and information, groupings, pay bands, worker demographic data, annual monthly pay salary information. They're going to have to analyze that, right? They're going to have to perform a gap analysis on at least 7 key metrics. And then they're going to be required to report it. Regulatory filings with national authorities, there's a public posting requirement, there's internal disclosures to workers and worker representatives. Deadlines for all of this is going to depend on the individual EU member state. The directive itself is not prescriptive there. Cadence is going to be either annual or once every 3 years, depending upon the size of the employer. Then for those employers who are found with an unjustified pay gap of at least 5%, they're going to have to conduct a pay assessment in close cooperation with their worker representatives that really analyzes that, collecting additional data, analyze it, and then they're going to have to be able to produce a report about how they're going to fix it, right? And so it really can get very intensive for those employers that are found to have what they think of as a significant pay gap, which that the directive does define that as at least 5%. I do see that some questions are already popping up in the Q&A. Please throw those in there. We're going to try to address as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. We'll leave some time over for that. And if for some reason we don't get to your questions live on today's call, we'll definitely follow up and respond to them. So please keep those coming. All right. The other aspect of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, as the name of it kind of gives away, right, is there are also pay transparency requirements inserted into the directive. And so I guess briefly, give you guys, for those of you who aren't aware, the kind of the differences here, right? So almost every EU country, as in fact, most countries globally have a pay equity standard of some sort in place, written into their laws. That standard often comes without any sort of compliance requirements with it. as jurisdictions add compliance requirements, a lot of a lot of countries go in one or two or both directions, right? They either implement pay data compliance measures or they implement pay transparency measures, and the EU directive has implemented both, right? So pay data compliance is kind of any requirement that you either collect, analyze, or report out some sort of metrics related to how you pay different groups. Pay transparency is about reporting either to employees or to job applicants certain facts and information about their jobs, and or limiting the kinds of questions that an employer can ask applicants about their current employment situation, whether it's compensation or anything, and also limiting what employers can do with respect to their employees talking to each other about pay, right? So within the EU directive, right, we have two main requirements, right? Transparency before reporting, so employers are required to disclose information about the initial pay level or its range, either the job posting, right, or prior to the interview. We'll see how individual member states implement this, because again, some member states already have pay transparency measures in the books. Is this going to be additive of existing pay transparency measures, or is this going to replace existing pay transparency measures, right? And then there's pay transparency during employment, where workers have the right to request individual average pay information categorized by sex for workers who perform the same work or work of equal value. And we've kind of glossed over this right now, but one of the things that both Nasser and I have found fascinating about the EU directive and also just the EU implementation of pay equity laws and regulations is their embrace of this concept of work of equal value, right? For those of you that are familiar with most US jurisdictions, we use different standards. And for example, the federal Pay Equity Act, Equal Pay Act, it is a very narrow standard, right? It is equal pay for equal work, right? Which, while it has expanded slightly under court guidance, is a very kind of narrow view of what you're comparing to, right? Many U.S. states have gone to a standard of similar work, or work of comparable work, which broadens it a little bit, but work of equal value really kind of takes the rails off, if you will, on employees' ability to compare themselves to other jobs and other job categories. So again, this is going to be fascinating as this is implemented, to see how different EU member states define work of equal value, because it really is a fairly broad concept that doesn't have a specific definition attached to it.
Yeah. And just going back, Maxwell, too, I think, at least, we move back a little bit in terms of the pay data reporting and the joint pay assessment. There is some analog to the EU Pay Transparency Directive in jurisdictions such as the UK and Ireland, where there is already sort of a reporting requirement where you have to sort of report on key metrics, such as these raw pay gap metrics, such as your pay difference between men and women, your median pay difference, your differences between bonuses. So there is an analog in terms of the UK and Ireland, but there's also kind of this additional now in the EU Pay Transparency Directive of this joint pay assessment, a real sort of teeth to what happens if you conclude that after you conduct your equal work for work of equal value analysis, there's still a pay gap. What happens after that? So there's more teeth in the EU Pay Transparency Directive, rather than just sort of reporting the pay gaps and publishing that report, and that's sort of it, right? So it's really an interesting feature of the EU Pay Transparency Directive.
I agree with you, Nasser. I mean, I definitely think that this added component of the joint pay assessment and this kind of ongoing, you actually need to fix it, not just because you could be exposed to a lawsuit from an employee, right, or some other entity, regarding a pay gap, right? But rather you actually have a compliance obligation to fix it, right? So now you have potential compliance penalties associated with addressing that pay gap, in addition to your potential exposure to employee lawsuits associated with pay gap. I think it's also interesting that they've picked that 5% threshold, right? So it really almost puts a bar there regarding what is a statistically significant pay gap, right? Because they've essentially defined it. You need to fix it if it's over this threshold, right? Which I think we're going to see that trickle into litigation throughout the EU as well, regarding proving up lawsuits and also, I mean, you're going to be publishing these things, right? So one of the challenges that employees have always had in the past with bringing equal pay action is how do you prove it? How do you have the information that can show that there is a pay gap? Well, now employers are going to have to publish it, right? And they're going to have to show how they're going to try to fix it. And then if they don't fix it, that's going to expose them to even more potential issues. So I think down the road, this joint pay assessment, and then also just this threshold that the EU Pay Transparency Directive has put in here, it's going to be fascinating how it trickles through both of the EU member state regulations as well as lawsuits in each individual EU member state related to pay equity. So that's, oh, sorry, no, I haven't gone over this yet. So Pay Transparency Directive, just the reporting requirements quickly, right, before we start diving into Sweden's proposed implementation, right? So generally speaking, there's regulatory filing requirements, right? And again, these are going to be dependent upon employer size, right, as far as who has them and how frequently, right? There's public posting requirements, right? So organizations are going to have to post certain metrics, and we didn't go into detail over those metrics in this particular presentation. But if anybody's interested in knowing about them, I think we've got a number of articles on our website that go into deep dives on the actual EU Pay Transparency Directive metrics. We're also happy to answer questions regarding that for anybody that has a specific question, right? And then while employers are not directly responsible for posting on their website, employer may publish data on its website or make it publicly available in another manner. Now, here's the thing. This is an area where we think individual EU member states might start to differ, though, because they can make it more strict. So individual EU member states may actually require that other data get made publicly available other than those initial metrics. And they also might dictate with a little bit more certainty regarding how it's made publicly available. We'll see as this kind of plays out over the next year. And then internal disclosure, right? So there's an internal disclosure requirement where employers must provide that pay data reporting information to their workers and or worker representatives, including individual pay levels, average pay levels, categorized by gender for workers engaged in similar or work of equal value. And then one thing that we didn't, it's in here, but we didn't call it out specifically, and this is mostly for our US-based people that are on the call that aren't necessarily familiar with the EU. So this is a gender-specific directive, right? So the only protected category here is gender. For those of you more familiar with the US pay equity standards, you know that there are a variety of different protected classes in a lot of those equal pay laws and a lot of those pay data reporting requirements. Here in the EU, it is a gender-specific, right, standard as well as gender-specific reporting. So that's our kind of brief overview of the EU Pay Transparency Directive itself. Again, if anybody has any specific questions regarding just the vanilla directive, please throw them in the chat. We also have a ton of resources, as I said, on our website that kind of go into deep dives on different aspects of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So there's a wealth of information there. And then without further ado, I'm going to let Nasser, because I'm sure he's chomping at the bit here, jump into Sweden and talk about their proposed implementation of the directive.
Yeah, thanks so much, Max. Yeah, and to sort of begin, I think it's useful to talk about what the current regulations and pay reporting requirements for Sweden are. Sweden does not have a super robust pay equity reporting regime like some other jurisdictions have. For example, some other jurisdictions require an annual report to be submitted to an internal body or a requirement to publish it. From my knowledge, there's no sort of publishing requirement in Sweden currently. However, there is a sort of requirement that employers monitor equity within their workplace, and if you're above a certain size company within Sweden, you have to document your work on sort of maintaining equity within the workplace. And that work can then be audited in terms of whether or not you're complying with the current sort of requirements. So some of those requirements are listed down in the regulations, complying with something called active measures, right? And what are these active measures? So you have to continuously apply a 4-step approach across various aspects of employment. And we'll talk about that more. You have to promote gender balance in the workplace. You have to establish guidelines and routines to prevent harassment, sexual harassment, reprisals, retaliation, and you have to conduct annual pay surveys, right? So as you can see, there's different thresholds based on your employee count, and obviously 25 or more employees are required to document all elements of the work on the active measures, whereas 10 to 24 only document their work on the pay surveys, whereas employers with fewer than 10, they still have to comply with this, but they don't necessarily have to document all this work. So, and we'll talk about that more, what these current requirements are and how they actually kind of fold into what the new requirements are. So expanding upon these these active measures required for employers currently, they have to sort of monitor their working conditions, the provisions and practices regarding pay and other terms of employment, recruitment and promotion, education and training, and possibilities to reconcile gainful employment and parenthood. So that is one of the active measures. And one of the active measures is to conduct an annual pay survey. So this is kind of going to a question I see in the chat. What does it mean to conduct an annual pay survey? So So to conduct an annual pay survey, you have to analyze the practices between the pay differences between women and men who perform equal work, and the pay differences between groups of employees who perform work that is considered by female-dominated employee, or performing work that is not female-dominated, right? So this is kind of a pay equity analysis, right? This is kind of what you would bring in someone like a Trusaic or another, pay equity consultant to understand what sort of gaps are in your current job. And in terms of the equal work for equal value analysis, that inherently kind of requires the employer to conduct sort of a job evaluation system in terms of comparing one job to another. And a lot of these terms, unfortunately, since we're doing a deep dive in Sweden, I might be throwing out terms like a job evaluation survey, which if you're kind of unfamiliar with this territory might be kind of new, but essentially what that means is you compare jobs to one another that might not normally be considered comparable, and assign like a point factor to each of them. So for example, how do you compare a secretary to a sales manager? You might, assign different values to them. And then based on those ultimate values, you have to assign a corresponding salary. Do you kind of agree with that assessment, Maxfield, in terms of how the job evaluation system?
Well, I think one of the one of the interesting things about Sweden, even though their requirements are not, or their existing requirements are not super robust, their annual pay survey does attempt to address kind of the two different issues, right, that are being trying to be fixed in the equal pay world, right? And that is, one, you want men and women who are performing work of equal value, work or similar value, to be paid equitably between each other, right? But there's also this understanding that there are certain groups, right, or job categories that have traditionally be female dominated, right, where they might not be being paid equitably as a group to other groups or job categories that are equal in value, right? And as a sidebar, and maybe we should do a presentation on Canada at some point in time. Canada just, for the most part, pays attention to that second issue, right? Of just looking at the job groups themselves that might be female dominated or male dominated, and making sure that the groups themselves are being paid equitably, without necessarily looking at individuals within the group, right? So it's interesting that Sweden kind of tries to address both, right? Because they try to address the pay differences between men and women who perform equal work, and the pay differences between groups of employees who perform work that is considered to be female dominated, right? And so versus the ones that are not female dominated. And so, I mean, I think one of the values to the EU Pay Transparency Directive and this broader standard, right? And you could see in our previous slides, right? The directive's pay equity standard really is equal work or work of equal value, right? They're really trying to embrace both of these concepts, I think, in the directive, of trying to understand how do we address historical bias against individual job categories that might be female dominated, as well as how do we address bias within an individual job category between the male and female employees within that group.
Yeah, that's right. And again, the core of conducting the annual pay survey, and we talked about this in our webinar yesterday if anyone's coming in from that as well, basically trying to find if the pay gaps are because of gender, right? Like, is a woman getting paid less because she is a woman, or is it because that the men in that position happen to have more experience, or they're more senior, or there's other gender neutral factors that can explain why a woman is paid more or less than a male counterpart? Right? So that's what the heart of conducting an annual pay survey is supposed to go towards. And along with this, there's promote gender balance and prevent harassment, right? So these are the kind of the current standards that are in place for Sweden. And to reiterate on this slide, right, the job evaluation portion we just talked about is kind of how you would be able to conduct in turn the pay survey, right? Because in order to compare men and women in terms of work, equal work or work of equal value, you have to sort of understand and fundamentally break it down whether these jobs are comparable with each other in terms of either a point value system or what have you, right? And then you would conduct a pay survey, you would analyze those pay differences, and then again, you would document your work, right? So this is kind of the current requirements that are in Sweden right now. There's no sort of requirement to publish this or report it outwardly, but that is potentially going to change with the proposed law. So moving into that, what is it? What is the proposed law? So in May 2024, Sweden released its first draft of the implementation of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. They're the first EU nation to release a draft of the law that must be implemented by all member states. The act would enter into force on June 1st, 2026, right? So I think that's a potential date that was on the proposed law. And the draft legislation includes an examination of the directive's requirements, areas where existing pay data reporting and pay and transparency laws meet requirements, and areas where Sweden will need to add requirements to comply. So if you look at the full text of the law, the Swedish government also provides commentary on the law itself, on why it proposed certain things, on what it's expecting. For the purposes of this webinar, I think we're really going to dive deep on just what is the text of the proposed law, right? Because we don't necessarily want to go too into the weeds on something that is proposed and might ultimately change, right? Like, this is not a finalized version of the law. It might change. There's a good chance it's going to look like what we're talking about today, but it's not finalized. So diving into the commentary might be a bit too much for the time we have. So for the purpose of the law, we're going to really just going to stick to what is in the text of the new proposed law. So one big component is something called salary mapping, which is in the law. So the proposed changes include additional requirements for employer transparency in setting and mapping salaries in order to detect, remedy, and prevent unreasonable differences in pay and other terms of employment between women and men. The employer must map and analyze every year, number one, provisions and practices on pay and other terms and conditions of employment applied by the employer, and to wage differences between women and men who perform work which is considered equal, equivalent, or of equal value. The determination of equal value must be done by considering criteria such as knowledge, skills, as well as responsibility and effort, right? So before, when I was talking about that, sort of these gender neutral factors, that's sort of what it's getting to. And let's move on. And here's a disclaimer. So we are not Swedish attorneys. I was a litigator in the United States for many years before coming to the United States. And this text that we are using, it came from an official translation service that we used and that we paid for internally at the company. But from my knowledge, the Swedish government has not sort of put forth an official English translation of the document. So take what we're putting in front of you right now with a grain of salt, in the sense that this is not an official translation of the Sweden proposed law, but rather we use a third-party vendor for their official translation of the law.
And that gets to a point that I think is going to be pretty relevant as each EU member state implements this. And this is something that Nasser and I have talked about a few times, is in the implementation and the fact that many of these countries do have different languages, that they're then kind of taking this directive that is written in English and then translating it into their own laws in their own native languages and then implementing it. Are we going to see some variations in how the law is implemented that aren't necessarily tied to intended substantive differences, but rather just linguistic differences, right, in meaning and in text as these things get implemented? So one of the things that I think is going to be interesting if you're in the pay equity space, and especially if you're in the EU, is once this has been implemented, to be able to look across the board and see, are there differences in France, in Germany, in Spain, in Sweden, that are not necessarily tied to a desire to have the directive be different, but rather tied to their own translation of this English written directive into their native languages, and then implementing it into law in their native languages. So
correct. Yeah, and now when I move into the next requirement, I'm going to go ahead and sort of group these, the salary mapping and the salary survey that appears in the new law. It's kind of like the pay survey 2.0. This is sort of how they wrap in sort of their old requirements under the, complying with the active measure into the new requirements. So when we were talking about the pay survey previously in terms of Sweden's current requirements, now this is expanded upon into the salary mapping and the salary survey or salary chart, right? This is a translation again. But this is how they've expanded what they originally had, and now we're going to sort of wrap it into what's required in the EU Pay Transparency Directive. So in addition to salary mapping, they have to develop a salary chart. And bear with me as I sort of read through this, but I think it's important to really kind of read through each of these, because these are specifically defined points in the law, which if you have 10 or more employees, you have to comply with, right? So what does the salary survey or salary chart entail? So you have to include data on the proportion of male and female employees who perform work that be considered equal or equivalent value, a report on the results of the salary mapping, what we just talked about, an account of which salary adjustments and other measures need to be taken to remedy existing salary differences that have a direct or indirect connection with sex, a cost estimate and a timeline for implementing the wage adjustments, which should be completed as soon as possible and at the latest within 3 years, a report and evaluation of how previous year's plan measures have been carried out, and finally, an account of how the obligation for employers to cooperate with employees is being fulfilled. And I, dive into briefly touch on one of the Q&As is, well, what does it mean to coordinate with your employees? There's generally a requirement to coordinate with your workers on developing your salary survey. And from my understanding, if you do have an employee representative body, such as in Sweden, the Workers' Council, yes, you would coordinate with the Workers' Council in developing the salary chart. So sorry to get ahead of our Q&A session, but I realized that was kind of a topical point there, so I want to bring that up. And then finally, okay, so the first two are kind of Sweden specific, right? And they're kind of building upon what they already have. Now here we get into the EU Pay Transparency Directive, straight up kind of codified in the Sweden's proposed law. And this is almost taken verbatim from the EU Pay Transparency Directive, where these specific metrics that a company has to perform on. If you're familiar with UK or Ireland pay data reporting, this is gonna look very familiar, right? Because these types of metrics are also apparent there as well. So you have to develop a payroll report, which contains 1, wage differences between women and men, 2, wage difference between women and men with regard to salary supplements or variable allowances. And when we talk about that, and this is also related to one of the Q&A that saw pop up, it could include bonus, commissions, overtime pay, severance packages, things like that. So these are, additional, with respect to those bonuses or other allowances, those aside from the base pay, those as well. And then the median wage differences between women and men, median wage difference between women and men with respect to the wage supplements or variable compensation, and then the proportion of women and men who receive salary supplements or variable allowances, and the proportion of women and men in each salary quartile. And when we talk about salary quartile, the way that eventually looks is that you have you talk about your top 25% earners, right? Your 50%, 25 to 50% earners, your 50% to 75% earners, and then your 75 to the lowest quartile of earners. And amongst those quartiles, what proportion of those are men and women? What proportion of those are men and women, each of those quartiles? And you have to submit this payroll report to the Equality Ombudsman, which is the Swedish entity in charge of actually carrying out the EU Pay Transparency Directive implementation and their pay equity reporting in general. And if the information shows a pay difference of 5% or more, the employer must explain how the pay difference can be justified with factual or gender neutral criteria, or how the pay differences must be remedied. Right? Employers with 250 or more employees must submit a payroll report annually, and employers with 100 or more employees must submit a payroll report every 3 years. So this is the joint. So when Maxwell was talking about that joint pay assessment and the EU Pay Transparency Directive, this is it, right? So these 6 metrics, they're kind of what I would call like raw pay gaps, right? There's no sort of nuance in terms of how you're looking at them. It really is just, not really taking into consideration seniority or experience, things like that. But that joint pay assessment is a pay equity analysis. In the sense, it's not a raw pay gap analysis. You actually are looking into factors to see if you can explain why, if you're over 5%, what are some factors, what we call them work influencing factors that can explain that 5%, over 5% pay difference, right? So, and if you're unable to do that, then, and I don't have it in the slide there, but if you're unable to do that and you're unable to remedy that difference within, I think, a 6-month period, you're also required to sort of submit your salary survey in the previous slide, right? So it's definitely a more onerous requirement than just what's in the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? This whole the whole salary survey we talked about in the previous slide is not really talked about much in the EU Pay Transparency Directive at all, right? It's kind of a nuance in the Swedish law.
Yeah, and that's, that gets to something that I've been wondering about, is are jurisdictions going to essentially double up on what may appear on their face to be similar requirements, right? Like this survey and then the implementation of the Pay Transparency Directive is essentially doubling up on Swedish employers' requirements as it goes to pay compliance reporting. And I think it's going to be interesting to see if other jurisdictions break with that, if there's any pushback within Sweden with Swedish employers on this proposal, such that we see something like that changed before final implementation. But I do think it's interesting that their initial push has been to double up on those requirements.
Right. And, along with kind of that payroll report, another sort of feature of the EU Pay Transparency Directive that just gets sort of imported into the Sweden law is the employee pay transparency requirements, right? So on the request of an employee, the employer must provide written information about the employee's salary compared to the average salary, broken down by gender for that respective employee group. And that information must be provided no later than 2 months from the request. And the employer must provide applicant current salary or starting salary range. The employer must also provide applicable collective agreement provisions. And here there's a salary history ban where the employer can't ask the applicant about salary from a different employer, right? So these are all from the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and these are sort of imported into the Swedish law. So, just to sort of reiterate, when we compare and contrast with the proposed law that Sweden's put forward versus what's in the EU Pay Transparency Directive, that payroll report component that Sweden now has is is kind of identical to the language that's in the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Now, there's going to be nuances that are eventually going to have to be explained by the Swedish government in terms of what types of pay and what types of compensation should be included in the variable and supplement components. There's commentary regarding what they're thinking right now, but it's not very clearly defined in the actual Swedish law or even the EU Pay Transparency Directive in terms of how to break out, bonus pay, sick pay, medical leave, or medical insurance as a form of, or as a form of compensation. So those types of components kind of need to be, expanded upon and explained potentially by regulatory authorities. But generally speaking, that payroll requirement in terms of those line items of things you need to publish, that is pretty much taken straight up from the EU Pay Transparency Directive, right? And again, those pay transparency initiatives were also taken from the EU Pay Transparency Directive wholesale. And then what are the main differences? What is the takeaway in terms of what's unique about Sweden? Is I think it really is that salary survey, salary chart that Sweden has to now sort of employers in Sweden have to create and potentially supply to the ombudsman in the event that they failed, that they trigger the joint pay assessment and they're unable to sort of remedy that 5% gap. That's a huge difference, I think, between Sweden's law and the EU Pay Transparency Directive in a way that Sweden kind of goes above and beyond the baseline requirements of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And in the proposed law, there's injunctions and potential fines if you don't comply. In the EU Pay Transparency Directive, it recommends that the EU member states have some sort of enforcement mechanisms, but it doesn't really lay out any sort of hard and fast rule on what the EU member states have to do. But the proposed law says, if you do not comply, appropriate fine, appropriate damages will be collected potentially, and there will be enforcement on this front. So that's kind of a big difference where there's actually teeth inside the proposed law. And with that, you know, how, Max, what do you think in terms
Yeah,
of
so,
justice
in
playing
our
out?
last few minutes before we take questions, just wanted to talk a little bit. I've been hinting at this throughout the presentation, but, you know, as we said, this isn't Sweden's final stab at implementation of this. This is their first draft. So, we kept this presentation relatively broad without going into the minutia of their requirements because many of those could change. But one of the things that has been our takeaway with reviewing this proposed implementation as we look at the EU Pay Transparency Directive is the fact that Sweden took the approach of layering, right? Layering their current requirements, maybe even adding a little bit to them on top of the EU Pay Transparency Directive requirements. And I had initially thought that many of the EU member states might do the opposite. They might try to homogenize pay data reporting across the EU and all try to adopt the vanilla directive. But at least from an initial blush, that does not appear to be the case with the ones that have existing pay data requirements. Now, it might be different for some of the ones that have more robust ones currently, though, right? Where it really is an intense regime of pay data reporting or pay compliance reporting that we're layering their current ones on top of the EU Pay Transparency Directive might be difficult. That, and we haven't even heard at this point in time how businesses are responding to this proposed implementation. And that to me is going to be an interesting question mark is, our business is going to push back on the idea of layering existing requirements with the directive's requirements? Are they going to strive to, especially for pan-EU companies, are they going to strive for a single, more homogeneous implementation of this law that kind of streamlines what they have to report across the different countries? So to me, that's kind of the fascinating takeaway. We'll still see what kinds of other implementations get proposed, because we could see a proposal from a different jurisdiction that has existing requirements approach it completely differently. And then it becomes a question of, does Sweden look at that and do they change course with their own? So again, this is very early. We're glad we have a glimpse at what at least one EU member state might do, but it's far from over yet as far as what we're going to see overall from an implementation, and then also what we're going to see in the details. I do want to make sure that we leave enough time for some questions, because it looks like we've got a few of them here. Before I jump to that, though, I wanted to make sure that we touched briefly upon our approach here at Trusaic to meeting all of these different global pay data, pay reporting, pay compliance requirements, right? And we think this framework is really helpful for everybody out there that's going to be facing the new EU requirements, that have existing EU requirements, those that might be in the US that are just joining this call because they're interested in learning more about the EU Pay Transparency Directive and that have existing requirements in the United States, or even others that have requirements in completely different jurisdictions like Australia or Canada, outside of the EU or the US. Right, so we take the approach here at Trusaic. We call it CART, right? This CART framework is really about collection, analysis, reporting, and then transparency. And we take this approach because we found that just about every pay compliance requirement put forward by a jurisdiction falls into at least one, if not more, of these buckets as far as what you need to do, right? There are some where literally all you need to do is collect the data. They require you to collect the data. They don't require you to do anything with the data. They require you to make it available upon request. You're just required to collect it, right? There are jurisdictions that require you to collect and then analyze the data, and then internally address any pay gaps or conduct some sort of assessment, but maybe you don't need to tell anybody about it, right? You just need to have done it, right? And then there are jurisdictions that have some sort of reporting requirement associated with either the collected data or the collected and analyzed data. right? And then you have transparency requirements that might get added onto here as far as how you're reporting it, who you're reporting it to, and also some of the other aspects that you might be reporting. And the EU Pay Transparency Directive really hits all four of these, right? There is a data collection requirement in order to fulfill your analysis requirements. You do have to analyze, and based upon the size, you have to report it at different cadences. And then you also have to make it available, and you have to have some other transparency measures that you need to kind of report back to internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. So we think this is a really good way to look at these requirements, especially if we do end up in a situation where this EU Pay Transparency Directive ends up just getting layered over existing pay data reporting or pay compliance reporting requirements in the EU member states, because this can end up getting really complex and difficult for employers. It's helpful to have a framework like this and or to work with a company that does this on a regular basis like Trizaic, where we can do all of the analysis for you, and we have a framework in place to help you with the reporting at the same time. And then last but not least, I'd like to shamelessly plug our next webinar, which is on July 16th. It's the second part of a two-part series. We completed the first part yesterday, which is going on just kind of a basic overview of legal frameworks associated with pay equity. We're going to deep dive really into pay data reporting or pay compliance requirements, and then also what we think of as opportunity compliance requirements, which is something that's relatively new, but that is being pushed in a lot of jurisdictions today. So if you can, we'd love to have you there. And if you want to, the recording is available for our presentation, the first part of it, which we did yesterday, in case you wanted to catch the first part before attending the second part. Anything else you wanted to add here as we think about the Truzaic's framework here, Nasser?
Yeah, I think you caught it. I think it'd be helpful to start maybe diving into some of these questions. I think this is an area where it's new, so people are very, very curious about how this practically gets applied in the real world. So, Olivia, do you want to introduce, start off the Q&A session? Yeah. So, and just also another disclaimer. I'll do some more research after the call and make sure, if there's any sort of errors in what I'm saying today, I correct it. But from mine, and this is sort of based on my reading of our translation of the Swedish law, but generally speaking, when you talk about that payroll report, those 6 components that need to be included, it includes sort of the variable and supplemental compensation, right? So bonuses and other types of pay that are sort of indirect, even potentially indirectly tied to that workers' compensation would be included in that sort of payroll report and ultimately reported on for the that payroll report and compensation analysis. So that's another kind of area with a lot of our clients. They're kind of grappling with the fact that their current payroll software isn't great at capturing some of these additional benefits and forms of compensation that they're ultimately going to be required to report on. So on that collection, we were talking about the CART framework, that collection stage is actually super important, because that's when we sort of sit down with what sort of data are we actually keeping track of on employee level, and being able to sort of rein in, okay, well, what health benefits are the employees getting? These are potentially all things that actually will have to be included in terms of that variable component, supplemental component part of the payroll report in terms of additional types of compensation employees are getting. And eventually that is a metric that is going to be reported on.
Yeah, and I think, just to touch on what Nasser is saying here is, one, I want to add the caveat that this is not the final version of what Sweden, as we've already said, of what Sweden's going to implement. And it also intentionally seems to leave a few things left unanswered. In this particular draft, there are some details and definitions that are not there. right? Because the EU Pay Transparency Directive purposefully left a few things vague, if you will, in the directive, with the idea that individual EU member states would kind of add some robustness around certain definitions and also have the flexibility to implement it slightly differently. So things like what is going to be included as pay, right, in order to be calculated within an evaluation, that is something that I think we're going to see a lot of different movement on, as far as what are they considering to be pay, right? What is going to be included in those calculations, and then also how do you value certain things like, you know, healthcare benefits or other benefits that might be a part of somebody's package with an individual company, but not necessarily readily turned into a dollar value. So it's a good question, and I think the hard part about answering it right now is the real answer is we just don't know yet how it's going to be included or not included. But we'll get more clarity, I think, as this moves forward.
And finally, just to harp on it, I think it's also good now for companies to actually be able to put frameworks in place where they can actually potentially break that down, right? So when the time comes to actually put this into practice, they're not scrambling to find those numbers and quantify those additional forms of compensation that they might not be tracking currently. So it's a good idea to sort of put that infrastructure into place sooner rather than later.
Awesome, thanks. Another question we have is, do global companies need to implement the directive only in European countries or in all countries that they are operating as their headquarters is in the European Union?
And again, with caveat, there's potentially some, the law has not been finalized, but to my understanding, that these EU member states and these countries' laws are applicable to entities within that country, right? So it would be covering the workers inside Sweden for that respective employer, for example. So it would be relative to that country.
And touching on that, this is where it's going to get complicated for pan-EU companies, right? Because you're going to have, just like you do today, if you operate in, say, France and Sweden and Spain, where you have three completely different compliance requirements within those three different jurisdictions based upon your presence there, you're going, even though the EU Pay Transparency Directive is kind of creating this baseline where things are going to be similar, you are reporting this data at a local level to the individual EU member state. And therefore, the applicability, if you will, as far as who has to report and what you're reporting is going to depend upon a presence in that jurisdiction.
Yeah, so one of the things we do for our clients is we do an applicability determination to determine, which countries that they have enough employees or workers to satisfy, that then triggers the reporting requirements of that specific country. So as they implement these laws, it'll vary potentially in terms of where you're going to be required to report in which country.
Awesome, thank you. And another question we have is if there's any guidance on pay ranges for applicants, if it just includes base pay, compensation and benefits, or anything beyond.
So the way that the law is currently phrased, it's phrased mainly as salary right now, and then it makes reference to any sort of collective bargaining agreements that might be in place for that potential applicants. Doesn't make any sort of a reference to additional types of compensation or career progression or something like that. So right now, the way the draft is currently written, I think it's just base salary.